It's Reality Check with Craig Price.
I'm an idiot.
4 minutes in and I'm already wrong.
I'm like a monkey. Hello, look at me.
You're like a beautiful mind. I'm more like Forrest Gump.
So it's,
Craig Price is the man.
I knew it. Craig, shut up.
It's Reality Check with Craig Price. I'm your host, Craig Price, and this week, author Barbara Lee is here to talk about Sextegrity. Welcome to the podcast, and thanks for listening. This is a show that if you subscribe to the newsletter at realitycheckpodcast.com, you better check your spam folder because we're talking sex and sexual integrity, or as my guest calls it, sextegrity. And I'm sure that the word sex automatically throws everything into your spam filter. But Barbara's latest book is called Sacred Sex, and it talks about the connection of sex with spirituality, respecting boundaries, and seeing sex as a healthy, not shameful things human beings do. Now, thankfully, Barbara has donated her entire book to the podcast app, so if you download the app, you can read Sacred Sex as a bonus to today's episode. But you can only read it if you have the app. I suggest you get it for your iPad or Kindle because it looks fantastic. But it's also available for Apple, Android, and Kindle products. So just head over to the website, realitycheckpodcast.com, and you'll find links to it everywhere. But enough of the foreplay. Let's get right into the action with the sex minister, Barbara Lee.
You talk about the difference between the sexual ethic and the marriage ethic. Can you explain those to me? Because I think I would like to believe I know the marriage ethic since I've been married for 10 years, but and only my wife can tell you if I'm following the sexual ethic, because I don't know what that particularly is in how you describe it. So can you describe the two and then tell me what the real difference is?
Sure. Well, the marriage ethic basically says that if you're married, sex is okay, and if you're not, sex is wrong. The problem with that ethic, well, there are several of them. One is that it has nothing to say to people who are young and single. It has nothing to say to people who are widowed or divorced. It has nothing to say to people who are single disabled or single elderly. It really has nothing to say to anybody who's not married. And at the same time, it implicitly condones a whole host of abusive and demeaning behavior as long as it takes place within a legally recognized union. Another problem with the marriage ethic is it's based on a property model, the idea that, based on an ancient tradition where men would use their financial means to secure sex and women would use sex to gain financial security and to raise their children. But that model presumes that we own each other and have the right to control each other's behavior, when in fact the only person we can control is ourselves.
It's one of the reasons that the father used to give away the bride. There was a doubt, So some of the traditions that we still have today are basically because we've treated women like property.
Exactly.
With dowries and such.
Yeah, and that model also presumes that the whole purpose of marriage is to have sex, and the whole purpose of sex is lifelong bonding. So I advocate that we need to replace a marriage ethic with a sexual ethic.
Okay, and so now I'm assuming when you say marriage ethic, it's not two married people with different spouses are still allowed to have sex. That would be bad too, I'm assuming.
I'm not anti-marriage and I'm not anti-monogamy, but I do believe that we need to move outside of this framework that says sex in marriage is okay and sex outside of marriage is not. I think when we treat it that way, we start labeling sex as a sin. On the other hand, we have society polarized so that the other side of that is treating sex like a sport. So my desire is to find that middle ground where we celebrate our sexuality while treating it with moral integrity. And that's the space I call sextegrity.
And my guest today is Barbara Lee. She's got a book out called Sacred Sex. And talk about this sextegrity. This would be your sexual ethics, I'm assuming, the integrity of your sexual lifestyle or your sexuality. So how does that differ from the marriage ethic?
Well, a sexual ethic begins by recognizing that everybody, no matter their body type, their sexual orientation, their marital status, everybody has the right to enjoy sex as part of a healthy life, enriching experience. And that we need to provide people tools for making thoughtful and discerning decisions about how they'll be sexual beings in the world. Sex serves a lot of purposes. It certainly is used for procreation, for pleasure. It can help us feel emotionally connected and find a sense of emotional fulfillment. It can also be a transcendent experience. But in order for that to be the case, two people have to make themselves vulnerable to each other. It can't be had when somebody's being exploited or when we're meeting our needs at the expense of somebody else. And so that's where defining the sexual ethic is about creating that intentional framework around which we will engage in sexual behavior and the boundaries that we have in place to protect ourselves and our partners.
Well, it seems like a lot of the sexual rules are double standard and heavily favored towards men. I mean, because we live in a world where they sexualize women, they sexualize children. If you're toddlers and tiara people, if you ever watch that show, and I recommend you do not, but they get them all up in there's a bathing suit competition for 4-year-olds, and that's disgusting. But yet we sexualize women and then we scorn women for having sex. So how is it possible to create a solid sexual ethic when you've got so much influence like that?
Well, that's exactly why we need to create our sexual ethic. When I was growing up, and granted that was decades ago, the risk that I had as a young woman was trying not to be labeled a slut on one hand or a prude on the other. And I think those labels aren't as prevalent anymore. I think the greater risk to our young people, and you're highlighting it, is the trivialization of sex. Young people, both boys and girls, are inundated with sexual content from such an early age. The average age of exposure to internet pornography now is 11 years, moving down to 10 years old. And at the same time, we're not giving our young people tools for navigating those sexual decisions. And you're absolutely right that women end up particularly affected by shame-based teachings and that double standard. But they're not. But it's not strictly women. Men are also victim of those kind of teachings. And as a result, in our society, we also have a lot of sexualized violence. As many as 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 6 boys will be sexually abused before they're 18 years old. So we need to address that as a society and not play into exploitive and demeaning sex. And one of the ways we do that is by becoming clear about our own sexual ethic and taking time to define that rather than making decisions in the heat of the moment.
So is it more than just, quote unquote, the talk, where you sit down and explain to them how babies are born? It's more about how you treat women? Because I'll give you an example of a cultural thing. I live in Texas. I'm not from Texas, so I didn't grow up here, but I've lived here for almost 20 years, and I've talked to guys, you do, and one of the recurring themes that I've discovered with men here in Texas, especially if they're native, is that at some point, their first sexual experience, when 16, 17, 18, a lot of the times I hear involved their dad or their friends going to Mexico and having their first sexual experience with prostitutes. Where I'm from, that would be unheard of. Usually you're made fun of if you thought, oh, I'm going to have you go to, you're so pathetic, you need a prostitute. But here in Texas, it seems like a rite of passage. And that kind of transfers what the value of women is. If you just treat them as, this is a barter system, I'm going to pay this person for sex. So all she is she's a vending machine. Do you find that cultural thing is regional, or is it generational, or is it just everywhere? Because it seems to be, unfortunately, there is no real demographic for violence towards women or mistreatment towards women.
No, I do think that the objectification of human beings, and particularly women, is happening across the country. And that we are feeding that through the way in which we treat sex as a sport, as a commodity, as the way we use it in our marketing campaigns, as a sales tool, and just as I said, the exposure to pornography in which particularly women are objectified. And the nature of internet pornography, too, is that it is getting more and more explicit, more and more demeaning, and more violent. And that sexualized violence is really seriously concerning, particularly for developing minds. We're even finding that an overuse of pornography is one of the reasons that older men are experiencing erectile dysfunction, which might be what actually starts making a difference in the kind of pornography that's put out there. But what they're finding is if men stop watching that pornography, they can get their function back. What we don't know is about young people who are being exposed to that kind of objectifying material while they are in the process of forming those neural connections in the brain. And unfortunately, we can't find out through control study tests because there's no control group. There's just not young men who haven't been watching internet pornography.
Yeah, because I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and so pornography was like you kind of stumbled upon it in the woods by accident. Little scraps of wet paper that had rain soaked over it. Oh, look, there's something there. So here you can Google anything. You can get access to anything. You can accidentally see it just by Googling something. You can Google.
Absolutely. You
can Google a legitimate phrase, and if you don't have the proper filters on, you'll get all kinds of weird stuff.
Well, Craig, I'll tell you, it's worse than that even. There are pornographic sites that intentionally have named themselves something very close to, say, a cartoon character's name. So you'll have kids literally looking for cartoons and accidentally pull up pretty graphic pornography.
So where do we start with the conversation with the children?
So with the children, well, I think we absolutely have to have the conversation with the children, but the first thing is we need to have that conversation with ourselves. We can't hope to pass down our values and our boundaries if we haven't figured out what they are first. So it does start with us as adults saying, what are the boundaries? How am I going to meet my needs without exploiting somebody else? How am I going to make decisions that protect myself and my partner? And why do I think that's important? And then have the conversation with our kids. We need to be aware of all of the messages that we've learned, both explicitly and implicitly, and those scripts that are playing in our heads. Because if we're not aware of them, then we simply react. Then we don't take time to consciously make decisions. And so we have to be aware of those messages ourselves and then hyper-aware of how we are passing those down to our kids. And well-intentioned parents and teachers and pastors and others often pass down messages that sex is scary and fearful, that masculine sexuality is predatory, and that feminine sexuality is destructive and evil, that it's the job of every civilized human being to confine sex within very narrow limits. And those fear-based teachings, those shame-based teachings, not only lead to repression, which can then lead to abuse, but they also lead to us dampening our own ability to enjoy and celebrate a healthy gift of sex.
So how can we start doing a self-assessment, especially if we've grown up thinking certain things are either bad or certain things that are okay that are not? It's one of those, if you think this is okay, it's going to be hard for you to sit there and realize, oh, wait a second, I need to change.
Well, I think the questions you start with are what are the messages? What's the number one message I received from my mom or my mother figure? What's the number one message I learned from my father or my father figure? And those can be explicit messages like sex is bad if you're not married, or it can be implicit, such as we don't talk about sex. So what were those messages? What was the primary message I received from school or church or my peers? And then, how have these ideas influenced me in the past? And what were the consequences? So just taking time to do that exercise to bring those messages to consciousness allows us to then be more thoughtful and discerning about our decisions going forward. And then there are elements that I believe need to be part of any sexual ethic. And the one that I like to stress the most, because I think it's the most overlooked, is mutual consent. That there has to be mutual consent each and every time we engage in a sexual act. And that applies even if we're in a committed relationship, even if we're married. Again, the double standard that you mentioned that we've raised women with has often led women to believe that once they're married, they don't have any choice in sex anymore, that they just have a duty that they need to fulfill. And we need to make sure that people understand that they have agency over their body, and that yes means yes, and no means no, and maybe means maybe. That we're not going to punish people when they say no, and we're not going to push and manipulate when somebody says maybe, but allow for time to play that out.
The consent is very important, but it's one of those situations where, for some people, it's not easy just to, you're in the moment, quote unquote, and then all of a sudden, do I need to have, the attorneys of Feinberg and Feinberg are here to have you sign this consent form? I think it's more the how-to for a lot of people versus, yeah, I understand I need consent, but how do you do it in a way that doesn't sound like you are doing a transaction?
Well, you have to be able to have a conversation. There needs to be communication, obviously, and communication and agreement. And that's where, again, if you take time to consider your ethic before you're in the moment, and you know what those boundaries are, and you know that you're going to make sure that you have an explicit yes. This is where, and this is where my heart goes out to men because of the mixed messages that women receive and the shame-based teachings. They often do send out mixed signals because they're conflicted themselves. The messages that come up and everything is going okay, and yet there's this need to be a good girl. And so both men and women have to struggle with those internal messages. But at the end of the day, unless somebody is explicitly saying yes, it has to be treated as a no.
Right. Mixed signals means no until you clarify.
Right. Exactly. And you can't give informed consent if you are drunk or under the influence of mind-altering substances.
Well, that brings you in a situation where when both parties are both in a mind-altered situation, just remembering and getting into the situation where, I need to be consciously aware of stuff. I mean, that's, I think, where a lot of people get into trouble is because the animal urges kick in and you don't think because you're drunk or you're on drugs, because it's hard to think, I've got to make sure that everybody's here is okay when you're getting those mixed signals. Instead, everyone's going to just go assume, okay, this is a go, because obviously, if your brain is in an altered state, they're going to assume the quote unquote the best. Oh, she's really into me. Let's do this.
Mm-hmm.
So how can you make sure of a situation like that doesn't happen? Besides not drinking, which is kind of ridiculous because a lot of people they never think they're going to get drunk. Some people do. They go out of their way to make sure that they get hammered. But some people just like, I'm going to have a couple drinks. I'll be fine. The next thing you know, they're in a situation where they could be in some serious trouble.
So again, it's about being thoughtful and discerning ahead of time. So if I'm going into this situation and I'm going to put myself in this kind of circumstance, what do I need to be aware of, both for my own protection and for the protection of my partner? And if I can't go into that knowing that I'm going to provide those protections for both, then my ethic needs to dictate that I won't engage in sexual behavior that evening.
Now, is there other areas that the sexual ethic needs to be applied on a more regular basis that you notice that we don't?
Well, I think Yeah, there's a number of them. Some of them are more obvious than others. I think, we have to have a sense of self-identity should be part of our part of our sexual ethic. We're not going to find ourselves in sex. We're not going to figure out who we are in sex. And I do think that's one of the mistakes a lot of our young people make. They try to pretend to be something that they're not, or they try to find self-acceptance by somebody else having sex with them, which is not how it works. We have to know who we are and like who we are, because we're not going to find that from somebody else in a sexual act. There's the need to engage in sex when we are in an equal power relationship. If we're having sex with somebody who does have power or control over us, we need to be aware that we are placing ourselves in a position of being taken advantage of. Likewise, if we engage in sex with somebody over whom we have power, we run the risk of taking advantage and abusing them, even if that's not the intent at the start. So we need to bring that kind of awareness. Of course, taking responsibility for protecting ourselves and our partner from sexually transmitted disease and unplanned pregnancy. And this is one of the places where you talked about the youth culture. One of the ways in which I think we're failing our youth is when we have abstinence-only training as opposed to teaching them to make careful sexual decisions. What we're finding is that a lot of young people think that they can keep a vow of abstinence if they only engage in oral sex and anal sex. And as a result, we're seeing sharp spikes in STDs because of unsafe sexual practices. They decide if they can't get pregnant, they don't need to take other precautions. And we're seeing that happening, in pockets all around the country. So again, the need to take responsibility for protecting ourselves and our partners. And that's true also in the older community. We talked earlier about the fact that STDs are growing among the elderly. People remain sexually active their whole life, and we should be celebrating that. We shouldn't be upset or ashamed or think there's something wrong with that. It's part of the natural life cycle, but we need to equip people with the knowledge that they need to make healthy decisions, including protection from sexually transmitted diseases.
Especially nowadays when you have so many communities that are based on seniors. I mean, they're together a lot. They get to know each other quite a bit, so they can actually build these connections and bonds. And they may not be long term, but they, you meet someone you like. And so and just because you're, 67 or 83 and they're 83 doesn't mean that, hey, these things still work.
Absolutely. And we should celebrate that. That's a part of the good gift of life. And so how do we, remain in a joyful place that is realistic about the risks?
Well, one of the last things that I know that you just got into was the situation with professional athletes. And I've noticed, and I think we all have, especially in the last year, we've noticed a lot more instances of professional athletes and domestic violence. Now, is it because they're athletes that they're getting exposed more, or is there something about being an athlete in a professional level that gives them, the more access or the more, I don't want to say their personalities have changed, but they feel that they have the right to do these things?
Well, it's the problem with domestic violence is, again, across the spectrum. So the percentage of domestic violence that's happening within the professional athletic community is no more than is happening around any other part of the country. The demographic isn't highly skewed differently. So what we have is an epidemic of domestic violence in our culture, period. Now, we also have the fact that celebrity status will bring out a lot of attention. We're also a culture that likes to build up stars and then loves to watch them fall. And so there's heightened awareness and attention to those kinds of crimes. And there should be. We look to people to be role models and whatnot. The good thing is if we can have an impact in reducing that across the country by paying attention to high-level profiles, then those high-level cases, serve a purpose. But the demographic is not skewed that way. You got to remember too, many of these professional athletes are just young men who, again, have not been equipped with tools, haven't been given the kind of the information that they need around sexual decision making, around healthy relationships, like any of our young men who are just trying to navigate their way in a culture that is filled with contradictory and confusing messages.
Well, I know that you do a lot of talks around the country. Again, the book is called Sacred Sex, and the author, Barbara Lee. Barbara, where can people find you and learn more about you and Sextegrity?
They can find me, the easiest place is my website, which is thesexminister.com, T-H-E, sexminister.com, or I have a broader website, barbaraleeauthor.com. My email address is barbaralee13@gmail.com, and I welcome a conversation, dialogue, and I really feel pretty passionate about the fact that we need to be having this kind of conversation all over the country. And too many places, we're burying our head in the sand, and we don't want to talk about it. So I want to help others get the conversation going.
Well, I certainly appreciate you bringing this out into the light and then helping folks understand that we need to change a little bit, especially in a lot of areas towards women. And so thank you very much, Barbara. I appreciate you being on today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Craig.
That's the show. Huge thanks to Barbara Lee for coming on the show and allowing app users to read her book, Sacred Sex. So download the app right now and you can read the entire book. Like the podcast on Facebook, follow Reality Check Pod on Twitter, and if you have any comments, questions, or guest suggestions, please email Craig at speakercraigprice.com. Have a great week.